Hi, everyone. Welcome to the How to Fish podcast by Tailored Tackle. I'm your host, Ed Hitchcock. I'm the owner of Tailored Tackle, and today we are going to go over an expert level episode. Now, I've been explaining this a couple times with the previous levels of episodes. What we're doing is we're doing beginner, advanced, and expert, which means that the focus of the show is within that range of fishing. If you're a beginner, that's somebody who just is just learning how to cast and figuring out what they need to buy. As a advanced angler, you're someone who has fished before but wants to get better and has some goals here. And then an expert level angler is somebody who fishes all the time but wants to learn how to get even better and maybe target a specific species, go for a trophy fish, improve their results and their skill set. And so we're covering the plethora. Now, no matter where you are on that spectrum of learning, you are going to get results from these podcasts. Now, if you're a beginner and you're listening to an expert, it might be a little bit confusing, but you're going to pick up on it. And if you use our online resources at tailoredtackle.com, if you download some of our How to Fish ebooks, we cover a bunch of different species and regions, you're going to get better and you're going to catch up a little bit and you're going to hear everything that I'm talking about here. You're going to be able to read them and look at diagrams and things like that. So if you go to our website, tailoredtackle.com, and you go to the resource section, you're going to see a link for the resource library. If you sign up there, it's totally free. You can download all of our ebooks. And these are just great visual resources that you can combine with the podcast. You can read along as I'm talking about things, or, what I would prefer you do is to, listen to the episode, go back and download one of the ebooks and start reading. And you're going to see a much more visual presentation of the theories, fundamentals, and lessons that I'm talking about here. So let's get started on this week's expert episode. We are covering, drum roll, it's a little bit of a tongue twister. We are covering cover and structure. So we're going to cover fishing cover and fishing structure. Now, these are two terms that are kind of confusing. I think that beginners all the way up to experts get these terms confused. And they're talking about the same thing a lot of the times. And so when you're reading literature outside of our Tailored Tackle ecosystem, you're going to see a lot of confusion here. And when you're watching videos, you're going to see a lot of confusion here. And so we are going to give you the correct definitions of both. And then these theories behind them are going to greatly improve your ability to locate fish and pattern fish. So that's why it's kind of an expert, is that we're really focusing on how to improve your fishing experience and your catching rates by helping you locate fish by thoroughly understanding cover and structure, these two fundamental principles, and then using them in your mapping and using them on the water, and using them to pattern fish throughout the season. So let's get started. I'm going to define them, then I'm going to give a bunch of examples, and then how I would strategically plan a fishing trip, or, just like going out on the lake or river, and how I would exploit these water features. Let's start with the definitions. So structure is the physical makeup of the water body. So that is the shape of the water body and what makes up the bottom of the water body. So what I mean by that is, let's take a lake and let's remove all the water and let's remove all the stuff in the lake. So weeds and docks and whatever's on top of the water or in the water, branches, logs, sunken boats, whatever it is, right? Let's just remove all of that, and then you're just left with this hole. Now, it's not a perfect hole, right? And so the hole has changes in depth, and it has different shapes down there, and also different areas of the hole are made up of different consistencies. So that would be like rocks and gravel and mud, sand, all sorts of stuff, right? So the structure of a lake is the structure of the lake. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's really the physical makeup of what's containing all of the water and the ecosystem in the lake, right? And so then cover is all of that stuff we took out. It's all of the stuff in the water and on top of the water that isn't the physical makeup of the whole. So that would be things like the weeds. So we put the weeds back in, and we put the docks back over the water, and we put all these other things that kind of create cover. Now, why are they called structure and why are they called cover? So all of these things that are in the water and on top of the water that aren't physically changing the bottom, right, itself, those are creating ambush points and shade and all sorts of stuff for the fish to live in, nesting grounds, things like that. So all of these things in the ecosystem are creating a bunch of environmental factors that influence fish behavior. Now, the structure of the water also influences fish behavior. So the depth changes the way that oxygen works, and that's super complicated, so we're not going to get too deep into that, but the level of oxygen is different in 5 feet of water versus 60 feet of water, right? And so oxygen level is different. And also just like the structural changes in the body, right, serve as a navigational system. So there's all these different structural features that we'll talk about that come in from shore, that come in from the bottom up, all sorts of things that allow fish to navigate and position themselves for different reasons. So when I'm thinking in a practical sense, structure navigates the fish. It puts them in a specific location, and they use structure to understand where they are and move around. They have internal sensors in terms of oxygen and location and water clarity and all these other things that are affected by the physical makeup of the bottom of the lake, as well as the structural changes in depth and, shape that guide them to move around for different reasons. And the cover are features in the water body that aren't part of the water body. They're different things that lay on top of the water, whether that's in the water or above the water, that gives fish an environment that they exploit for a variety of reasons. Now, I learn best through metaphors, and if all of this fishing language and terminology doesn't make a lot of sense, I want to have you understand this principle via a metaphor. And the best one that was explained to me is a swimming pool. So if you were to have a swimming pool, right, the swimming pool itself, like the physical construction of the swimming pool, right, is the structure. So there's steps on the side of the swimming pool, and the swimming pool goes from, let's say, 5 feet to 10 feet, right? That is the structure of the swimming pool. And then if you were to go and throw a ton of floating toys on top of it, and, some of those sinking torpedoes or whatever toys that sink too, right? All of those toys that are sunk on the bottom and all of those toys that are floating on top, that is cover. So if you put a fish into that swimming pool, it's going to move back and forth according to the depth and maybe hold around those steps where you're going to walk in. And then it's also going to use all of the toys in there as the ecosystem, they're going to use it to their advantage. So that's conceptually, if you didn't understand all of those fishing terms, that's how you could conceptualize structure and cover. Now, it gets confusing in a lot of different media sources and educational material as experts alike with beginners confuse these terms. So when you see somebody talk about all the weeds down there in the water and they say, wow, this area is really thick with structure, that's the incorrect definition. But if you conceptually know both, you can translate that back, right? Because these are the real terms. And I have talked to hundreds of expert anglers, and like the people that really know what they're talking about, they define them the way that I'm defining them. And while it sounds persnickety and nitpicky, what's really confusing is when you interchange them. And so I want you to be able to consume information and resources outside of our ecosystem to learn even more. There's plenty of people out there that are teaching awesome fishing skills. Just if you know the definitions, make sure to kind of translate them as you're consuming this content. So if somebody's talking about weeds and they keep saying the word structure, you should know from this podcast that they're really talking about cover, right? And so, yeah, and that gets confusing too when they say like maybe like a bunch of boulders down in the water are covered. They're really structure because they're part of the structural makeup of the bottom. But they do actually kind of serve as cover, right? Fish use them for shade. They use them for ambush points. So it gets a little confusing. So do your best now that you know these principles to translate them back and forth so you can really comprehend the information that that educator or that outdoor writer is trying to communicate to you, because otherwise you're going to be like, what's going on? Now, how do you use these principles to catch more fish? What I like to do is I like to use structure to map out my position, my starting positions and locations on a body of water before I have fished it and when I start to fish it, right? So I position myself on different structural transitions and key structural features that I believe fish are using or traveling through because of a bunch of different factors that we'll get into in later episodes. But I use that to get started. And then once I understand that region, that area, according to the structure, I look for cover to target the fish because I want to think like a fish when I'm getting started. So fish move around and they position themselves according to structure. That's why they go to a certain region of the lake. Then once they're in that region, they exploit cover for all sorts of other reasons too. We're going to get to a lot of this later on in the episode. And so if a fish thinks that way, I want to think that way. So I find the region first that I want to target through structure. And then once I look at the region, once I get to the region, I look for cover and transitions to pinpoint those fish. And then I start kind of checking off the box. And so let's kind of talk about the process of actually implementing structure into your day of fishing. I use Navionics. We're not sponsored by them or anything, but this is a super affordable option for you to either fish from shore or even fish on your boat or ice fish to understand the lake's structure. So these are maps, GPS maps of North America. And I think the package is super affordable. It's like $15. I wouldn't fish a body of water without it. That's how important it is to me. And so I can map out a body of water because the map shows me the change in depth, and it shows me, because of those changes in depths and those contour lines, what the general structure of the lake is. So the shape of the water body along the shore, as well as these changes in depth, show me the structure of the lake. Now, I'm not going to know exactly what the bottom consistency is just from the map. I can have some good guesses. That's something I've got to learn when I'm out there. And I also am probably not going to be able to identify the exact cover based on the maps. But over time, you're going to kind of create a relative checklist in your head where it's like, okay, if this structural transition that I want to fish is on the shoreline, it's probably going to have rocks or weeds. Or if this structural transition is not even a transition at all, it's just a flat piece of ground that covers, tens of miles and it doesn't change in depth, it's probably going to be the same cover all the way through. So there's some principles that you'll pick up on via map reading, and we're going to have a later podcast that really goes into how I map lakes before and while I fish them. But for now, just understand that you really need a map to comprehend the full structural makeup of the lake. And, you can get away with, especially if you only have a couple locations to fish from shore, you can get away with just going there and looking at it and identifying some of the structure as you're fishing. But again, it's like $15. Like it's I bought lures that are $15, and so if this is something that I use forever on every single body of water, I highly recommend that you get some sort of GPS and it's a one-time purchase. Anyways, I sound like a Navionics salesman. I have no affiliation with them. It's a tool that I use no matter where I fish, before and while I fish, because a lot of the times I'm not on a boat. And so if you are on a boat, a lot of people have electronic fish finders that have GPS mapping capabilities, and those are more precise and exact. So because you're listening to the expert level episode, I'm sure some of you out there have these. Yeah, that's the like heightened way to do it. I think everybody will be fine if they just use Navionics. It's pretty spectacular in terms of, figuring out what the lake looks like and then positioning yourself, because it's GPS. It'll show you where you are in relation to the structural features and what the lake has. So when I'm looking at a map and I'm looking at structure, there are some main structural key features that I focus on that I know generally hold fish at some time of the year. And those fish could be a variety of species, but like what I mean by key structural features is that a species at any time of the year is going to be positioned to it for some reason. And so there are fish there. It might not be the fish you want to target, but there's fish there. And so some of these key structural features, I'm going to break them into two. More and more theories. Sorry, guys, but these are important. The two theories are there's inshore structure and then there's mid-lake structure. So inshore or nearshore, the terms are interchangeable. I'll use nearshore. Nearshore structure are the ways in which the land mass around the lake kind of affects the shape of the lake. So those would be things like points or peninsulas, where those are key landmark features that jut out into the water that change the bottom consistency. Now, chicken or the egg, right? Was the structural feature there before the lake was made, or did it come after? Most of the time it was there before. But, apples and oranges, doesn't matter. So these nearshore things are what most shore anglers are going to use. So nearshore is often points, peninsulas, ledges, so and flats. And so these are all things that are typically within 100 yards of the shoreline, and they typically stem from the physical makeup of the shoreline. So a point is a higher elevation land feature that gradually declines in the water at a much slower rate than the rest of the body of the water. So if you could imagine a finger jutting out, and so that finger is going to steadily decline, even though it's jutted out, maybe let's say 100 to 200 yards on the lake, it's going to jut out at a much slower and gradual decrease in depth. So that would create a situation where there's, let's say, 100 yards that's gradually getting deeper, and it's going from 1 foot to 2 foot to 3 foot to 4 foot to 5 foot. And at the end of that 100 yards, it gets to, let's say, 10 feet. But then on either side of that, it could drop off way quicker, where it's, 10 to 15 feet in depth on the left and right side of it, while it's only, 3 to 4 feet deep on the point itself. And that can get kind of confusing with peninsulas, because peninsulas can be a point, but oftentimes they're just a steady drop off all the way around, where a peninsula is typically a high point in elevation that juts out into the water, and it ends at the end of the peninsula. So the peninsula typically doesn't continue its gradual pace down into the water like a point would. A peninsula would be this jutting out feature in the water, and then on all sides, including the front, and the left and right side, it immediately drops off. So those are the kind of like the two things. Now, a peninsula can definitely be a point, but maybe 70% of the time, it's just going to be that heightened elevation landmass doesn't continue into the water. It just goes straight off on all the sides. So that's point. That is a peninsula. Then you've got these drop-offs. And drop-offs are typically associated with things like peninsulas, but they could be on the side. And you can usually see them when there are steep structural features outside of the lake. So if you were to go and drive around the lake or walk around the lake and there's these cliff sides or bluffs that abruptly stop and then the lake starts, there's no beach or anything. That is typically a drop off where it's just going straight down way earlier than the rest of the shoreline. And then a ledge is another near shoreline structural feature where it would be like that bluff got submerged. So let's raise the water body all the way up, right? And we're bringing it all the way up to the top of that bluff. And that bluff is submerged by like 2 or 3 feet. So if you were to walk out on the bluff and it's submerged, and you're walking out on 2 to 3 feet on shore, and then all of a sudden it drops off, that's a ledge where you would be standing on the ledge in 2 to 3 feet of water, and then that drop off occurs right on the edge of the ledge. The last one that can be found near, there's 2 more that can kind of be found near shore. One of those is a flat where this kind of happens a lot. It happens in bays, and it happens just in, kind of pond-like structure of a lake where you have a large swath, not a large swath, but like a large parallel section of the lake that is all the same depth. So there could be a huge block that runs all the way along the shoreline that's 3 feet, and it's like 50 to 100 yards of just 3 feet. And then it goes 50 to 100 yards of 4 feet and 5 feet. And so these flats are typically all of the same bottom consistency, whereas these different, changes in depth, these abrupt changes in depth, typically correlate to transitions in the bottom makeup. So if you were to go onto a point, oftentimes what you'll see is like the point's really rocky or the point's really sandy as it goes gradually down, whereas like the left and right side could not be rocky or sandy. It could just be muddy or weeds or whatever it is down there, and it could just still be rocks and it could just still be sand. This is why it's challenging, because you're not down there, and you can't read that on a map. But typically what a flat would do is a flat would keep the same cover all the way along it, and it would also keep the same, which is the key point here, is that it would still keep the same structure consistency. So if it's a flat and you see weeds and you know that this flat runs a mile, you're going to have to bet that, you go 500 yards to the left or right, it's still going to be weeds in that same spot, because typically the depth and the structural transitions dictate what the bottom transition is. And so that's why we loop the bottom transitions in structure with the actual physical layout of the structure, because typically around that structural line, that transition, it's all going to be the same. Typically, I say typically a lot because every water body is different, but we're giving you the 80-20 at all times. Anyways, so, the last thing on near shore structural features are going to be like creek mouths. And these are things where creek mouths are typically where water inflows or water outflows, and it creates a structural change in the consistency as well as the depth, and then has a bunch of other environmental things. And so we'll have a whole episode on creek mouths, basically anywhere where inflows and outflows occur on the shoreline. Just know that they're a huge ecosystem changer, and fish will definitely stage on both sides of them. So if you're looking for a spot to fish from shore, before we get too deep into it, go and try fishing the creek mouth. There's a bunch of reasons why, and it would take me an hour to explain it, but just know that some species is going to stage there. It is a great spot to try. So those are all the inshore things, and you can conceptualize them very easily without even a map, because you're walking around and you're saying, okay, these features are clearly changing the shape of the lake. I can physically see them. There is a bluff here. There is a point here that I'm walking out on. There is a peninsula that I just walked to the end of, and I can see on both sides I'm covered in water. Flats are a little bit tough. You might have to walk out to them and see, or walk the shoreline to see them, and creek mouths are pretty obvious. So these are all things, the near shore ones, that you can map out on your own, but they're also pretty easy to just see on a map. That's why, it's just way more efficient to look at them on a map. Now, why this map is also important is because you have mid-lake structure, and mid-lake structure can only really be seen in contour maps. And so these maps that I'm talking about, the Navionics ones or anything on your GPS unit, they have the ability to show you contours, and contour lines are changes in depth in the water body. So you'll be able to see, and they're color coded. They're usually darker for shallower, so like a darker blue, and then white for deeper, and then they change in that kind of color palette from dark blue to, aquamarine to light blue to white. And so these contour lines are important because they will dictate the shape of the water body. So while they're presented to you in depth, the depth is typically consistent around the body of water. And so while it gets skinnier and it gets wider at different points in time, 1 foot of depth typically, will circumference the entire lake, and then 2 feet will circumference the entire lake. And while the distance between 1 to 2 feet can change, it can be 100 yards, it can be 3 feet from 1 foot to 2 foot, it's going to cover the whole lake. And that's why the contours are super important, because they're going to show you abrupt and even gradual transitions in depth that'll create a picture of the shape. So that will show you the mid-lake structural features. And here are some key mid-lake structural features. The number one is a creek channel. So what happened before most lakes, not all of them have creek channels, but with most lakes, the lake is a low point in the topography of the entire region, right? And so there was typically a creek there that would run through, where water would drain off. It would come down from the sides of the higher elevation and it would go to the bottom of the lake. And then at some point in time, whether that was during the Ice Age when the glaciers came through, or we just man-made filled it up with water, or different climates created a big pocket of water, whatever it is, these creek channels were so embedded in the land that they run through the deepest section of the lake. And they go from, especially if the lake is still creek fed, where it would be like an intro to an outro, basically a creek flowing in and then a creek or river flowing out. That creek channel will typically follow that line. And so this line is present in your map, where you will be able to see a consistent, let's say the lake is, the shallowest point is 0 and the deepest point is 15 feet, you're going to see kind of like a white line with gradual steps going down to that line that runs all the way through the deepest portion of the lake. And so creek channels are great because they are a very easy navigational tool for fish to move around in, because you've got the deepest section, it follows in a line, and they can move around it to get to different areas of the lake, whether that's through and around points or into bays or into the flat. They can use it. It's just an easier navigation tool for them. But these structural transitions are, again, best identified by depth. So if you have a rapid change in depth, whether that goes deeper or that goes higher, that creates a structural feature that the fish are navigating. So let's go on to a couple more. A sunken island would be basically, beforehand, it was a higher point before the lake got filled up. And so you've got really deep water all around you, and then an abrupt and typically circular area, the island itself, that is higher in elevation than the bottom. So all of a sudden, in the middle of the just like you'd see in a regular lake, when if there was an island in the lake, you can see the island. Well, let's say we raised the water levels up 10 feet. That island is sunken, but it's still underwater. And so let's say the top of the island is 5 feet deep, but the sides of the island are just like normal deep. They're 15 to 20 feet, which would be like the maximum depth of the lake, let's say. And so this is important because fish can go up and they can feed up to it. They can, sit on the sides of it, whatever. It's a major structural feature. So that would be going from deep to shallow in the middle of the lake somewhere, where, like, how are you ever going to see that? You're going to have to see that on a map, or you're going to have, floated over it and been like, okay, it's here. I went down with my snorkeling gear and saw it. Things that you'll absolutely not see without a map are holes. So holes are the inverse of that. It's like the deepest section of the structure. And so let's say just randomly everything is 20 feet, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere it drops down to 40 feet and then it goes back up. I don't know why that got created, but it got created at some point, and there's a hole there. There's an abrupt transition in depth that decreases. A little bit of a middle ground on these are humps and saddles. So that would be like rolling hills that got sunken at some point in time, whether that was originally or later on at a later date. Rolling hills will basically create these humps where all of a sudden you've got 20 feet in depth and then 5 feet in depth and then 20 feet again. So that would just be like a singular hump. But that can also create a very interesting structural feature when it's matched by a second hump. So if you were to imagine a rolling hill where you crest the top, you go back down, then you go and you crest the top again because there's rolling hills, right? That would create two humps together. And then that middle area between those two humps is called a saddle. And saddles are super interesting because it allows fish to go back and forth between the humps and then use a travel corridor. It basically funnels them through in that deeper section where they can go in and out and travel. So those are kind of the main mid-lake structural features that you're going to have to read through the contour lines and the changes in depth. So I know that was a lot of information, but all of these key structural features will hold fish at certain times of the year. Like, I plan around that, and I position myself that way. And a lot of times they contain a crazy ecosystem, right? And so, like, the weed growth and the bottom transitions, when there's a steep transition that's happening in structure, it typically influences the cover. So a lot of times, like, let's put a hump or an island for an example, those changes in structure also change the way that the cover works, where in the middle of the lake, you've got these weeds that are 5 feet below the surface, that are just like the shoreline, and they grow at this very rapid rate in comparison to the weeds that you'd find in 20 feet. And so all of a sudden in the middle of the lake somewhere, there is a beacon where all of a sudden there's all of this great cover for prey to hide in and predators to stage in those deeper areas and quickly go and attack them. So it serves as a beacon and it draws fish in. So let's talk about cover a little bit. I like to look at structure first, and then I try to find the cover and target the cover accordingly within those structural features. So let's say we're doing near shore stuff. Well, first let's just cover all of the cover. So cover is going to be, some really common examples are going to be weeds. So we talked about weeds, and we've also got other things in the water that are serving as cover. So that could be like fallen logs and stumps and things like that got submerged at a later date because the water levels changed. Most of the time we're talking about weeds when we're talking about cover in the water, under the, from the bottom up. And then there's the cover that comes from up top, right? And so those are the docks and the boat lifts and the bridges and the causeways and whatever else is going on top of the water, that's providing shade and an ambush point. So And so that too, I get a lot of questions like that from beginner bass anglers. They're like, why is everybody fishing the docks? Or like, if you're a homeowner and you have a dock and every time you go out to go fish on your dock, there's like 3 bass anglers pitching lures into your dock. The reason why that one's so great, and this goes back to this principle of structure and cover, is that when you were to put a dock out on the water, you're putting it out because you want to reach the deeper section to swim. So theoretically, most docks should start shallow and then go deeper. So there's a structural change that's happening there. And that's typically coupled with a transition in the bottom consistency. So weeds can't grow in sand typically. Weeds need kind of a muddier bottom. And so all of a sudden, typically, when you're walking out on a dock, and if you go walk out yourself, you're going to see that the first, couple feet of the dock is going to be a sandy transition, and then the deeper section, or the middle section, is going to be weeds, and then the deeper section is going to be no weeds, because people want to get over that sand and those weeds to get to the deeper section to jump in. So all of a sudden you have these features that are these cover features that are basically placed on the water body dependent on the structural transition so that people can swim and put their boats in and stuff. So there's a structural transition happening underneath the dock, and then the dock itself is serving as cover. So it's almost a flawless play 80% of the time to go pitch bass lures by docks, because you know that there is a structural change happening in the depth. There's a structural change most likely happening in the bottom consistency, and then the dock itself is providing shade and an ambush point for predators. So that's a great example of finding cover on top of a structural transition. Other things of cover, there's just like natural cover that happens too above the water. So that would be like overhanging branches, lily pads, things that float around, honestly, also kind of work well. Even kind of crazier things like water trampolines and diving platforms and things like that. Anything that sits on top of the water that changes the water clarity via shade is a cover feature. So let's walk through how I am approaching these things. So I look at my map and I say, okay, I am going for this particular species. Let's say it's walleye. Walleye are very, very dependent on structure, and they're less dependent on cover. So I am focusing primarily on structural depth transitions as well as bottom consistency transitions. And so those are typically the deeper sections too of the inshore structure as well as the deeper structure. So I'm typically fishing in 15 to 30 feet of water for walleye. And so they position themselves in those deeper sections along the points, along the drop-offs on the peninsulas, and on the deeper sides of humps and sunken islands, because they move around during the day and at night. I mean, the day they're a little bit more lethargic, but they're moving around at different times. They're bicuspal, I think it is, or bicuspal, whatever. They feed at night and they rest during the day. Now, they will feed during the day, but like typically that's where they get amped up. So they stage in the deeper sections during the day, and then they move shallower at night. And what's the best way to position yourself, if that's how you feed, is to position yourself right on the deeper sections in the transitions from deep to shallow. So around a sunken island or around a hump or on the sides of a point where you've got that right shade because you're deep enough, you've got good oxygen, you've got the right water temperature. You can just kind of relax there on the side of the structural feature. And then when you get revved up at night and need to start eating, you only have to move 100, 200 yards to get up into that shallower area where the bait fish are sitting around. So that's how they're thinking about structure. So that's how I'm thinking about structure. And I don't want to move a ton either. So I want to pick a couple key structural features, like a couple humps and a couple islands and a couple points. And during the day, I want to fish the deeper section of those. And then I know that they're moving from the deeper section to the shallower section at night, or in the morning, they're moving from the shallower section to the deeper section. And so in those kind of like prime hours to fish, in the early morning or the late evening right before the sun goes down, I want to position myself, kind of along the travel corridors that are going from that deeper section to the shallow section, right? And then once it hits night, I'm going to fish those structural features on the shallower section, right? And so that's just an example of a fish that's more heavily structure related. Now they do feed on some cover, and so like they will cruise the weed lines and the weed edges, and they will stage themselves in boulders and things like that. But in reality, how I'm really targeting them is through mapping and structural features. Now let's talk about something that's more dependent on cover. So bass are typically more dependent on cover. So bass can pretty much, hang out in 2 to 3 feet of water just as well as they can hang out in 20 feet in water. And so what they're really looking for is sections of the water that provide them shade and also a great ambush point. So they typically stick hard to cover, whether that's in the weeds or under docks, or logs or things like that. They will use structural transitions too, though. They will use deeper areas to stage to feed quickly up to the shallow areas, but they're typically feeding all day long. And so I'm primarily thinking about cover with them, where I want to pitch into docks like we talked about earlier, and I want to fish along the weed lines, where the deeper section meets the weeds. Oftentimes bass will stage on the outside of the weeds with all of the bait fish sitting holding really tight in the weeds, and then the moment that bait fish kind of crosses the line where it transitions from weeds to no weeds, that's when bass just come up and smash them, and they feed a bunch of different ways. So that's just an example, but I'm typically trying to fish cover for bass, but here's the big point, right? That's my primary thought process, but in order to present my lure in a way where I don't constantly get stuck on a dock or get stuck in weeds, and also to kind of take advantage of what their position is to the cover, I am still focusing on structural transitions that change the bottom, which would affect where the dock is positioned, and it would affect where the weeds are growing. And so I'm not technically always fishing the dock. While I might pitch my lure under the dock, the majority of the bites that I'm getting are 3 to 5 feet away from the dock, because they're staging either under the dock where no weeds are growing because there's no light, or on the other side of the weeds, where they're not stuck in the weeds, but the weeds are still shielding them from the light. And then they're pouncing on things that move around. And so there's a lot of conflicting concepts there in that example, but the key point is that I need a structural transition most of the time to present my lure appropriately, and also the bass are going to be staged on that structural transition, whether that's depth or bottom consistency. So you're thinking about both. There's some species that you are going to be thinking structure first and cover second, and there's some species that you're going to be thinking cover first, structure second, but you almost always need both to really maximize your catch rate. So with the bass, again, I'm finding something that provides them cover. I know that they absolutely want cover at almost all times, but the spot on the spot in that situation is going to be the structural transition next to cover. For walleye, I know that they are structure related, but they are predating on species that are cover related. So I still need to find cover around those structural features that I know that they're feeding off of. So it would be very useful if I found a point or a sunken island or a hump where there are heavy weeds and heavy cover for their bait, their prey, so that I can position myself according to where I think that they're navigating and staging themselves on the structure in relation to the cover that they're feeding on. And so that's where you really step your game up, where I think you are going to benefit a lot from looking at water bodies in terms of cover and structure. And I think that some species are going to be more heavily dependent on one or the other. But if you want to absolutely maximize your catches on that species, you want to find both, because that'll give you the spot on the spot. These fish position themselves and use the environment that is created by the cover to feed. And so if they're actively feeding, that's the best time to put your bait in front of them. But you also are just trying to find fish via the navigation routes, and that's where structure comes in. And then you are trying to present your bait in front of them around cover where they're feeding or using it. And those can be interchangeable. They can use structure to feed. They can use cover to feed. They can use cover to position themselves. They can use structure to position themselves. And so there's a lot of factors that are influencing it. Most of the time they're using structure to navigate and they're using cover to feed. So if you can get both of those together, that's where you're going to find the most success.